All right, here we go. This is it. First episode of a new podcast na I've been really looking forward to also this kind of podcast. So for quite some time, one of the things I realized, gentlemen, is that, when it comes to the Philippines, marami tayong mga magagaling na analysts, experts, academics. You can go on and on and on. But I think one thing we really have to build on is this kind of hindi naman ilustrado for the 21st century, but something like kind of, solidaridad, a group together, group things, sharing ideas. And I always say, we don't, there's no need to compete to be the Philippine analyst. I think there's enough room for everyone to succeed and thrive. And in that spirit, I've been very happy. I've been very inspired to see a new generation. Di pa naman ako matanda, but a new generation of analysts rising. And in fact, a few months ago, I was just thinking, let's just make a recommendation about this new analyst and all. Next thing I know, the responses were very positive. Just in case may mga weird people na nag-add sa inyo, baka ako may kasalanan. So I just felt it's time, to get the ball rolling, to work together, and to make sure the spotlight covers everyone and all great ideas. And I notice all of you gentlemen, of course, we'll have more inclusivity down the road. This is just the first efforts. All of you have had backgrounds in governments or are still in government or are advising the government, perhaps informally. So it's not like we're just armchair people. We have had direct interaction with the government and sometimes as policymakers or policy advisors in different capacity throughout different administration. Having said that, thank you very much again for joining us. Let's go one by one. Yung pahamak muna natin yung isa na nasa gobyerno pa rin. Sir Miko, maybe a bit of background about you, Sir Miko. I mean, how did you get involved in the West Philippine Sea analysis? How did you get hooked on the whole West Philippine Sea issue? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you, Sir Prof. Richard, and good evening to my colleagues, Joshua and Justin. So I started to be interested here in the South China Sea in around 2012 when the Scarborough Shoal incident happened. I was still in college then. So my bachelor's degree is political science, and as all of you know, political science has lots of branches. I decided to focus on international relations, and then after graduation, I got employed at the National Defense College of the Philippines. At the time during the Aquino administration, so the issue then, as it is now, was still among the top foreign policy challenges of the country. So I decided to focus my research on the South China Sea issue. Got myself published in a number of publications. Most of my writings are about the South China Sea, and then after I obtained my master's degree from UP Diliman, also my master's thesis is also partially about the South China Sea as well. And when I got an opportunity to teach at De La Salle and UST, I also delivered lectures on the South China Sea issues, got to talk to policymakers. Being NDCP as a think tank of the Defense Department, I tried to focus most of my research there. And now as a military officer, as a core professors of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, I still focus my research on those issues. So that's a brief background. Thank you, sir, for the opportunity again.
Salamat, Miko. We'll do more marites about your work and all of that, short of getting you fired later on. Thank you so much for getting the ball rolling. Ikaw, Justin, Mr. Justin Bakisal, can you also share a little bit about your background and how you got into the business? Alam ko you guys are also quite, you made some waves also in the Shangri-La Dialogue not long ago. Along with another good friend of ours, si Commodore J. Tariela. So kayo pasaway sa Singapore. Can you give us some idea about the whole drama and how did you arrive at where you are today?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I started working on West Philippine Sea issues more than 10 years ago. So aftermath is also same as Miko nung Scarborough Shoal standoff. So 2012 was a really talagang historical marker for us. So afterward, the Philippines filed a case against China, right, with the arbitral tribunal. Now, we developed an organization called the National Movement for the West Philippine Sea. We focused particularly on basically talagang building up support for and explaining to the people why we had to file a case with China at a time when people were very skeptical of the merits of filing that case to begin with in 2014, 2015. And then, of course, 10 years later, I'm still in the same organization. I'm the vice president for external affairs. So I try to build up the network for that organization. it's a global movement now. We have members in Pag-asa Island, so they're directly affected by them. Tinutulungan namin yung mga bata sa Pag-asa Island. We give them donations for school supplies, and every time they have a graduation, we also make sure that we show support to them para magkaroon ng effective human presence in the area. And then in between all of that, I worked in the government, first with the Office of the President, under the time ni President Duterte, and then of course I moved to the Department of National Defense. So in both cases, I was doing strategic assessments and planning. So that's my background on the West Philippine Sea issue.
Okay, we'll go back to Duterte later on. Your time there. We have a lot to discuss. Now, ikaw, Josh Espena. No, hindi Espanya, Espena, just to be clear about it. Josh, kamusta? What about you? How did you arrive at this? I mean, of course, the first time we met is when you kindly made sundo to me to give a talk dun sa. So you used to be in the AFP, right? Can you give us a little bit
Yes,
background about it? Yeah.
Buti naman naalala mo pa yun. Akala ko nakalimutan mo na ako.
Anong tingin mo sa
Well,
akin?
I
Marites
started-
ako,
Oo.
Marites ako.
Well, I started my work back in 2017 as an educator. Actually, napaka-striking ng question. Sir, tinanong ako ng student ko, a STEM student. So usually, ito yung mga walang pake. Actually, I was asked, sir, what is this West Philippine Sea? Where is it and why should we care? Nag-step back ako actually kung paano ko sasagutin to sa mga taong walang pake, walang time actually. So, mula noon talagang itong mga estudyante na to na yung naging inspiration ko to do my homework actually. Then after ng brief time ko doon sa first education job ko, I moved to the AFP, specifically doon sa Office for Strategic Studies and Strategy Management, o yung tinatawag nilang awesome. Actually, that's how we say it there. So ito yung sabihin na natin personal staff ni CISA, Chief of Staff, Armed Forces of the Philippines. So I got there noong 2019 and doon ko nakilala si Miko personally. Pero actually before ko pa siya makilala, medyo nauna-una na kasi siya. So quite a fan, so to speak, ni pareng Miko. And then we formally met back in 2019 November sa isang Track to ASEAN Institute na meeting sa may Clark. So doon kami nagkakilala. And then I'm also a graduate student ng time na yon and working on my thesis on naval diplomacy ng Australia, Japan, and India to the Philippines. So I'm trying to work on why in the world states are using these things na akala natin dapat hindi na ginagamit sa international relations. Pero lo and behold, di ba? States are using militaries to get what they want. So sabi ko, mukhang magandang karir to At nakakatawa lang kasi boom, pumasok ako sa PUP as a lecturer, no. So historically speaking, alam naman natin ang kwento ng PUP when it comes to their sentiment to the military, no. Pero nakakatuwa lang kasi when I introduced yung strategic studies for 2 years now, actually going 3 years na siya, very receptive yung mga students. Sir, ganun pala yung paggamit ng military. May tama at may mali. Exactly. So I've been helping them to make sense how do you use it. Kasi sinasabi kong framing lagi, sabihin na natin you disagree with some things that governments do, but at the same time, hindi natin may iwasan that militaries are tools of the state. So gagamitan ng pera. They love spouting yung tinatawag nating good governance. So sabi ko, dito niya ipasok yung good governance. How do we allocate our defense budget? Well, si Justin maraming masasabi yan later, pero doon ko sila finiframe and they're really convinced na okay nga sir, no. So aside from teaching, I'm also a resident fellow sa isang think tank, International Development and Security Cooperation, since 2021, and ako yung sabihin na nating strategic studies guy nila sa loob ng IDSC, and thriving itong think tank nga yun actually kasi
With
this
Dr.
week,
Chester Cabalza, right?
oo,
Yes.
tama, kina Dr. Chester Cabalza, which was by the way my former teacher kasi after kong lumabas sa AFP, nasa radar niya na pala ako na nagsusulat on the West Philippine Sea issue. So i-decided na i-recruit ako for this organization. I'm very happy kasi IDSC and PUP has been my home for years now to allow me to speak my thoughts on West Philippine Sea, etc.
Thank you very much, Josh. I was a bit worried that you'll get into the analysis. Parang wait lang, may mga
No,
issues pa tayo
no,
with
no.
that. Yeah.
Payapayaman.
Yeah,
Oo.
relax lang, gentlemen. The reason we made
Oo.
this podcast is precisely to make sure that we can go, yung masinsinan, hindi lang mga pa-cute, hindi lang yung mga cloud chaser style na, admittedly, sometimes I had to do that also on Twitter because no choice, you have to get people's attention so that you do the right thing. As Socrates said, you have to seduce people into truth. So self-admittedly, sometimes we have to be a little bit exaggerated, but at the end of the day, dito makakaalaman sa podcast kung may alam ka or hindi. Kasi within 1 hour, obvious na kung wala ka talagang alam, pakit lang ang ginagawa mo. So of course, I'm not going to be presumptuous. I mean, first of all, just to be clear, this is not the final composition, just in case sabi ng iba, but puro mga gentlemen, we look forward to this group to expand. In fact, one of our friends, Don McLean-Gill, is also supposed to join us. Unfortunately, is I think under the weather right now, so we hope he can join us in the future. This is kind of a mini movement, right? A podcast that we believe is part of a broader movement. So please don't bash us and say bakit puro kayo mga lalaki dyan, etc. Don't worry. We're gonna fix that thing sooner than later, hopefully. Now, going back to this, of course, not to be presumptuous, I'm Richard Hidarian. I'm currently teach at the University of the Philippines Asian Center. And I used to teach also in LaSalle. I also used to teach in PUP, and I think nakasabay kami ni Josh when they asked me to be the professorial chair for geopolitics. So I was very happy to do that during pandemic time too, no? So 2021, etc. So I'm very glad that different universities coming in. I also taught at Ateneo de Manila University. Now, how did I get into the whole West Philippine Sea issue? Well, I used to work in the Philippine government legislature. I advised at least a senator, so I advised also a congressman. They happen to be smartest people. I mean, I'm talking about people like Miriam Defensor, Walden Bellio, pretty big people, right? I had to deal with back in the day. And I remember very well, I was in a Foreign Affairs Committee kind of hearing when the whole West Philippine Sea issue and Scarborough Shoal came to fore. And after going through all of that, I never looked back. I never looked back. So for the next years, probably 2,000-3,000 articles, and one way or another has to do something with South China and the Philippines, and a number of books on this. Anyway, this is not about me. Looking forward to other. I just didn't want to be presumptuous. Nakilala tayo ng mga tao, so I just had to introduce myself very quickly. Now. Let's start with the big questions. I mentioned Socrates a while ago. We'll go Aristotelian in the next episode. We'll start tactical, operational. But now let's talk grand strategy, big questions. Now, since medyo nagfe-feeling ilustrado of the 21st century tayo, medyo young Turks, let me ask this question, gentlemen. Maybe I'll start with Justin, and then we can go from there. Do you think this is the moment? Because remember, Benedict Anderson famously argued that, nations are imagined communities, right? And the process of imagination is crystallized through common victories and common, tragedies, right? And usually, if you look at anthropology, schismogenesis, how First Nations came about, nations always came about in juxtaposition or contraposition to something else, right? I can start with the first heroic societies in Turkey versus the Babylonian counterpart, and then we can go on and on with Germany, Prussia versus France. So the tendency is that, nationalism and nationhood has a lot to do with questions of war and peace, has a lot to do also with the urgent sense of dealing with the threat from without. And you may disagree with me, all right? Maybe this is a very UP stance, but my argument always has been that one of the problems with us in the Philippines is that we have been in the shadow of a superpower for quite some time. In fact, the institutions of the Philippines are very much patterned after America. In fact, 19th century America, late 19th century America, and the Philippine Constitution, jurisprudence. Yes, there was 300 years of Spain, European power, but in many ways, I would argue that we kind of outsource our external security exigencies and needs to the United States throughout the Cold War period and throughout the 20th century, to be honest, even when we gained our supposed formal independence. So my way of looking at it, and please go ahead and disagree with me, is that this West Philippine Sea issue, this is the glue that is bringing us, the Filipino people, together. In fact, yung pagiging Filipino natin, yung pagiging excited natin, has a lot to do with how we are pushing back and resisting the bullying that is happening in the West Philippine Sea. And the reason I say this is because, a lot of us have relatives in the United States. A lot of us relatives who actually are in the American Armed Forces. And I heard that there are many Pinoys, second generation Pinoys, who are more than happy to be stationed in the Philippines under EDCA, etc., because they want to fight for their motherland, even if they're Americans, second generation and Filipino Americans. So for me, I think something bigger is happening here. This is not just a territorial dispute, as important as it is. This is not just a maritime issue. This is an existential national identity issue. This is like what the Rizal and Ilustrados were facing in the late 19th century, right? This emerging sense of what it is to be a Filipino. Am I exaggerating this? Am I reading too much into this? Justin, what is your take on this? This national consciousness, nationalism aspect to this?
No, I fully agree with you. No, I think yung juncture ngayon is very important because we're seeing the birth of historical consciousness in the Philippines when it comes to our geopolitical interests. In the past, of course, we've had colonial subjugation, of course, but really we were focused on internal security threats after that. So even after independence from America, 1946, formally. After that, we had the Hukbalhap rebellion. And so it's really very inward looking, right? But right now, we are being defined by an external threat in much of the same way that other Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia or Malaysia have been defined by an external threat at the moment of the birth of their country. So right now, I think what we're seeing is yung rejuvenation of that sense, pride of place nga, ika nga, of where the Philippines stands, that a lot of countries right now, they talk about de-risking from geopolitics and of course deconflicting. But the Philippine case is opposite because we are right at the center of the geopolitical conflicts between the US and China, between ASEAN and China, and between our own geopolitical conflicts with China. So even if some of us aren't interested in geopolitics, geopolitics is certainly interested in the
Very
Philippines.
Trotsky.
Exactly.
Trotsky.
So I think going forward, I think this is a very important period for the Philippines. Na right now we are having conversations about how to deal with the threat that is China. I think everybody can understand the threat that is China, but what is the operational response to China, right? So those are the things we're trying to work out right now. Whether it's a policy of trying to have good relations with China, if that is enough to make them stop bullying in the West Philippine Sea, or whether we need to have a more of a muscular foreign policy, trying to bring in, for example, more concrete military assets, trying to enlist foreign support in the theater of operations and so forth. No? So our generation specifically is grappling with these questions, right? And right now, of course, the AFP is also grappling with this question, right? As it shifts yung focus niya from internal security. This year, the AFP declared that it now has a strategic victory of the Communist Party of the Philippines. So the internal security threat, which many have known for a long time, isn't really the major security issue in the country anymore, right? So it's really the external security threat. So right now, all the different sectors, whether that's civil society, the manong and manang in the street, they know what the threat from China is. Our own AFP right now, medyo may institutional soul searching na nagaganap. How do you reconfigure your force structure to address an external security problem, which they haven't done historically, right? Since World War II. So all of these things, yan ang nangyayari sa Pilipinas ngayon. We are witnessing, of course, the rejuvenation of our historical consciousness, but at the same time, there are different interpretations of how we imagine this national community.
Thank you very much for that, Justin. Miko, I mean, is this the rebirth of a nation? I won't say birth of a nation, that goes to Rizal's era, but is this the rebirth of a nation? Like the Philippines rediscovering itself, its place of pride, its sense of national resilience and strength. Miko, how do you see that? I mean, of course, you're also now in the Armed Forces of the Philippines. How do you see this soul-searching process as a Filipino and also member of the Armed Forces of the Philippines?
Yeah, thank you, sir, for that question. Again, if I may just note, the views expressed are mine alone, and do not necessarily reflect the views of my organization. But going back to your question, sir, I completely agree with you and Justin that we are indeed living in very interesting times, and the public, there's data to support on this argument because there is public opinion polls that are strongly against China. Of course, there are opposition within the country, few of them, but although with very deep pockets, maybe we will discuss that later. But yeah, I agree that there is this growing consciousness among our public that and our place in the world. And you could see that actually in the official publications of our government. During the Duterte administration, again, we could discuss this further later on. Although the president was saying one thing, his national security establishment is actually saying another thing. In the national security strategy and national security policy of the Duterte administration, it explicitly articulated how the security establishment viewed the country. This emphasis on this archipelagic and maritime configuration of our country and how it attracted major foreign powers. No? That kind of language was not actually seen in previous administrations. Because as you said, sir, ang focus talaga naman talaga nun ay yung internal security natin.
Yeah, Justin was explaining it, not me.
Sorry, Justin mentioned it a while ago na yung focus talaga before was internal security, but now even among the general public, talagang may clamor for us to beef up our defense capabilities as well as to strengthen the armed forces of the Philippines. No? At saka yung ano talaga it's very palpable sa mga, even the civil society movement, yung organization ni Justin, even the late National Security Advisor, Roy Lugones, has his, and together with Secretary Alunan, has their own grouping. So it's really very palpable na yung, because of this external threat, this idea of,
Right.
Yung Filipino consciousness. And maybe another point to add here is that siguro lalo na dun sa generation natin, those of us here in this podcast.
But just to be clear, we're all millennials here, right?
Yes.
Just to be clear.
I think Justin is, if I'm not mistaken, the youngest in the group.
Gen Z, hindi ka naman Gen Z, Justin, no?
No, technically still millennial.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Ako, I have to admit, I am the oldest generation Z.
Sige.
And that, maganda yung framing ko. Yeah, oldest generation Z. To be clear.
Kasi yung generation natin, we are, going back to sa 2012, which I think is when most of us, not just tayong apat, but also the general public, talagang nagkaroon ng consciousness about this South China Sea issue. Kasi before, episodic siya. Ngayon kasi it's almost on a daily basis, may nangyayari sa South China Sea. But since then, talagang our generation lives in a period wherein the international environment is undergoing through a transition. The last time it went through such a transition was in the late 80s and the early 90s, yung end of the Cold War. Ito, yung from one order to the next, that which is in itself unique kasi that transition was relatively peaceful. No? Kasi transitions in world orders are usually violent, as in the book of Graham Addison proved, yung Thucydides trap. But yung generation natin ngayon is it's unfolding in our very eyes. Yung different developments around the world, not to mention yung war in Ukraine and so on. But yun nga, we are siguro pinag-usapan namin ito ng mga classmates ko before. Parang ang sarap maging political science student now. Maybe compared maybe in the late 90s or the early 2000s. But ngayon, lalo na kung IR yung major mo, ang daming case studies. No? So forums like this could really help. But going back to your question, sir, yeah, I completely agree na talagang there is this growing consciousness, which I think, as Justin said, pattern talaga yun. I mean, with all due respect sa other ASEAN friends, yung Singapore was born out because of this Malaysian trend, diba? And yung other countries. So I'll stop there and I'll let.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. I mean, it is true. I mean, how should I put it? I mean, the thing is, we are our age. I mean, we're all in our 30s or late 20s, maybe in the case of Justin, I don't know. This is also the era of rise of China, right? Before we were born, China was, sorry to say it, kind of a dirt poor giant North Korea. Our era, just as we grew up, China grew into this immensely powerful and now in a very technologically sophisticated country, right? I remember 2015, we had an event in Tsinghua, and it's like everyone was using QR code. All these were using QR code. We were the only idiots with cash going to the shops, and they were looking at us as if we were like, Homo erectus or something like that, right? Dinosaurs. And doon ko lang nakita, this is different. This China is going to be a force to reckon with. And now in Manila, you're going to see also a lot of Chinese cars, including EV cars by China. The BYDs I'm seeing are really, really nice, among others. So our era has also coincided with that. But unfortunately, we're on the front line of the not so good side of this new superpower, right? We are the frontline nation. Although I don't want to steal it away from Taiwan. The situation of Taiwan is much more stark than us, but we're kind of there, right? Josh, how do you see this in terms of a critical juncture? And do you also think that this is also potentially the birth of a whole epistemic community, of a whole series of strategic thinkers in the Philippines with a focus on West Philippines? I don't think we had that before, right? Purong counter-terrorism, yung mga ganyan, mga experts dati.
Kung titignan mo kasi yung ating historiography, actually. Historiography, by the way, refers to the historical scholars, yung mga historians natin writing how we write our narratives, actually. Yung historiography natin has been focusing on the consolidation of nationhood. And it stemmed back actually nung late 1800s, no? And makikita natin na yung West Philippine Sea, syempre, we have just named it nung 2011 with the Republic Act, di ba? Pero ang ganda lang na isipin natin that itong dagat na to, matagal na nandyan yan. Di ba? If you know what I mean, no? It's just that tayo kasi yung nagpuput ng meaning. No? The mere fact that we named this as West Philippine Sea connotes the idea that we are now putting meaning to places. No? These places would now have people, hence there would be spaces. And these spaces would have meaning for us. And itong meaning na to, nakikita ko actually na ito yung isang napakagandang episode sa ating historiographical development. No? Maraming mga pagkakataon na kung saan we have to revisit our pages of history kung paano magiging continuum itong kwento natin ngayon. Kasi kung titignan natin, as we can observe, yung panahon nila Aguinaldo with the First Philippine Republic, they also had a share of concerns with rising great power. Di ba? Ganon din ng panahon nila Manuel L. Quezon. No? Rising great power din. America was once rising power. Nagwo-worry, is this a friend or not? Maybe. Oo. Ganon din yung Commonwealth government eh. Kasi kung titignan mo yung mga records, if you would read nung debates nung 1930s, yung sa legislation, Senator Claro M. Recto and yung kanyang contemporaries, si Senator Camilo Osias, nag-aaway sila actually what to do with our strategic posture. Sabi ni Recto, itong Japanese Empire has to be dealt with a sound national defense posture. Pero para kay Camilo Osias, at binak ito at that time tumakbong presidenteng Emilio Aguinaldo na matanda na, sabi nilang dalawa, why don't we rely on the spirit of international justice? No? Ito yung tinatawag natin sa IR literature na idealism. No? So, umasa tayo. Pero nabigo tayo and alam na nga natin ang nangyari ng Second World War. No? So, in terms of IR, in thinking that, ang argument ko kasi, natuto na tayo. In a way na great powers, may ambition sila. And they will go through great lengths to get what they want.
And
sa akin, I'm speaking from 2023 actually. So, noong 2010s, iba ang usapan kasi natin. We've tried the previous administration, no? Na baka hindi, pero clearly merong ambition ito and maapektuhan tayo. So, in other words, ang gusto ko sabihin dito, napaka-interesting para sa mga historians on how this will unfold. And it's up to us kung paano tayo magre-respond. Kasi baka mamaya, baka maulit lang yung nangyari last time. No, nagoyo tayo ng mga rising great powers.
Right. That's absolutely correct. I mean, Josh, in fact, one of the lectures I gave in PUP when I was a professor chair was the comparison between Aguinaldo, balancing between Spain and rising America or declining Spain. And then later on, of course, to the Commonwealth era, we're talking about Manuel Quezon trying to balance between Imperial Japan, rising Imperial Japan, and kind of America withdrawing. And then now what's happening. And my argument is how I wish our leaders now are a little bit less of Aguinaldo when it comes to geopolitics, a little bit more of Manuel Quezon, right? Speaking of which, maybe I can, this is the last part for this episode, just to get the ball rolling. How does Duterte go down in history? Because just to be clear about this, I think I made a lot of enemies early on during the Duterte era when I said, well, I mean, maybe him saying we shouldn't rely on the US and we should diversify relations isn't the worst thing in the world. It's just that, of course, later on how it was executed is another question. I felt he raised good strategic questions. In the same way, I also have a lot of disagreements with Trump, but I think Trump also raised some good questions about, hey, what is this networks of alliances we have? Is this serving our national interest? Is this really the way forward, right? So I have big questions with populism. I've written books about what's wrong with them, but I always agree. There's one thing that makes populists very popular, or at least makes them win, is they raise good questions. They frame the issues pretty effectively. Now, so definitely, as Justin said, we're not here to bash people, personally speaking, but Justin, siguro for the last part of this episode, because we're talking about the rebirth of a nation, what is the historical role? I mean, if you were a historian 50 years from now, how are you going to write about the role of Duterte? Because he was quite a shock to Philippine foreign policy, and whether it's a good shock or not, it's something we can debate. But how do you see that, Justin? Nakamute kaya ata, Justin.
Okay, sorry. I think this is quite a controversial opinion, but I would actually think that Duterte was a phase that the Philippines had to go through, right? Our foreign policy has never been so different under his administration compared to all other previous presidents, and I think it actually benefited the country to actually try out a foreign policy and still see that despite us trying to better relations with China, the threats posed by China remained the same or constant, such as yung maritime incursions nila, not just in the West Philippine Sea, but also in the Philippine Benham Rice, in the northeast of the Philippines. And really, the bottom line is that happens because by virtue of China's size. No? So regardless of its intentions, the nature of its scale, sabi nga ni the late Professor Aileen Baviera, it's going to be threatening to the Philippines regardless of its intentions, because it just has a huge military presence in the region. It's trying to push out into the Pacific Ocean, and by whether we like it or not, we have to respond to that. So I think the Duterte administration can be viewed in that sense na it was a phase we had to go through to realize that we actually needed to stick to the basics of our foreign policy. Kasi during the Aquino administration, some people were that was the question. Why are we so reliant on the US? No, why are we undertaking lawfare under international law to bring China to court when it's at the end of the day it's guns versus pieces of paper, right? And Duterte asked those important questions, as you said, and fortunately for us, we did realize that there is wisdom in our alliance with the United States. Even if yes, things aren't going to go back to the same as before. The Philippines right now is trying to have a more equal partnership with the United States, even if we fall short in practice, to try to have some more self-respect for ourselves. And of course, I think the US right now is reciprocating that. So I think when we look back at the Duterte years, I think it's going to be a critical juncture wherein we tried something else, and we realized that hindi tayo pwedeng mag-try ng bago just for the sake na magkaroon lang ng something new, right? To try something new for its own sake. We cannot have that. And ultimately, we're going to look back into this period as saying na we need to have a consistent and coherent foreign policy across administrations. We cannot have pendulum swings na yung from Aquino to Duterte radically different. And in a way, it's a lesson for future presidents as well to respect continuity in foreign policy, because foreign policy has to be grounded on territorial integrity, national sovereignty, and these things should be constant across administration. So yes, they can tinker with policy, how they will want to relate to China and so forth, but they cannot do it in a way that undermines the core military and defense interests of the Philippines. And I think that's a lesson learned for.
Thank you. Maybe I'll go Josh first because Miko is because he's still in the government. Just love is sweeter at the second time. It was that what Duterte was all about, to make us realize the value of our alliances. What's going on there?
If you look at the story kasi ng Philippine strategic development natin, you have to look at why did Duterte do that, no? Aquino, Duterte, and then what we have right now. Ang argument ko kasi dyan, when I wrote a book chapter on this one, is that ang ginagawa ni Duterte is by and large a consequence or so-called strategic effect na ginawa ni President Aquino at that time, no? So I argued that there are 4 ways na ginawa si President Aquino III in order to act on China's rise, military modernization, strategic partnerships with Australia and Japan, and then the lawfare with the arbitration ruling, and then itong alliance with the EDCA. All of these things, kung papasok ka doon sa isang strategic effect, ito yung ina-act on na trabaho ni President Duterte. Now, nandito tayo sa post-Duterte. Basically, ang lumalabas ngayon is that whatever Marcos does is by and large a consequence kung ano man ang mga naging maganda at hindi magandang kwento na nakita natin during Duterte's time. And indeed, I would second what Justin mentioned na we had to go through that phase. Just to point out the fact that we tried. Okay, perhaps Aquino III was wrong. Let's try the other side. Pero hindi nga nag-work. This, if anything, is the current itong current na phase natin is a trying moment for us. Okay, kung ayaw natin ng too much of this, too much of that, perhaps let's try this one. And yun nga yung sinasabi ko na argument ko for many times sa iba't ibang pieces ko na perhaps let's forget Duterte from now on. Let's focus on what Marcos Jr.'s government in terms of foreign policy, paano niya i-continue lawfare, and also yung pag-put forward ng defense posture natin. Doon na tayo. Kasi, ano man ang gagawin niya will generate a strategic effect towards the next president. At ano man ang mga gagawin niya will just produce another strategic effect. And it's an interesting thing for scholars, especially historians, to talk about regarding the unfolding of our Philippine history. Kasi kung titignan natin, napakabata pa natin. Sa totoo lang. Laging sinasabi yan ng isang professor na talagang back in UP sinasabi niya, bakit mo kinukumpara itong Pilipinas sa ibang bansa? Marami pang kakaining bigas, literally.
Wait, Josh, Singapore is younger than us. United Arab Emirates is younger than us. I don't know. When was Qatar?
Of course, no.
I get your point, but let's not give ourselves too much.
It just so happened that we went through a lot in these things. Now, so ako naman cautiously optimistic ako on how we can unfold these things. Kasi perhaps siguro mas magandang i-judge na lang natin to. Siguro at the end of this century, kasalanan na ng generation to. Perhaps may kinalaman tayo doon. Kung ano man ang gagawin natin, we can do podcast, pero kung wala ngang impact, kawawa yung next generation. So yeah, it's a big and a heavy commitment itong ginagawa natin actually. No.
Well, by the end of the century, probably an AI version of us is gonna pull this off. So let's make as many versions of ourselves online so that ma-AI tayo by 2099 or 199. Thanks for that, Miko. I wanna just to play the devil's advocate here, or rather angel's advocate. I don't know whatever. My sense is I see the attraction of a teleological, almost a Catholic argument. Now we had to be punished so that we realize this and that. But ang point ko is I have 2 things with that. First is the argument of path dependency. Many of the things that Marcos Jr. is doing right now is because he just has to correct the mess that was created under the previous administration. So that's one argument I have against a more teleological way of putting it. The second one, parang tumakas yata si Miko. No? The second one, wait lang, di ba ako tapos, Miko? Wag kang tumakas. First is I have an issue with teleological argument, with all due respect to that point, because in fairness, Justin, you're not the first to make it. But you know, and then mahirap to make that argument on EJK, right? I don't think we had to have 20,000 people killed potentially for us to learn the value of human rights. It's easy to say that if not, you're not part of the victims, right? But the second one is, and this I believe is more controversial, because I think, Justin, your point is more, it's more of a, it consoles the argument that, you know, it's unfortunate, but we're gonna learn from it. Medyo may pagka Coach Chot Reyes learning experience. Mag-move na tayo, baka mag-gold. No, my second argument is, I think Duterte had good strategy, pero yung implementation went wrong somewhere because he just didn't have what it took. So parang he had a good idea of the big picture, parang he's a good architect but horrible engineer. Do you get what I'm saying? Like nung sinabi sa kanya anong itsura ng bahay na gusto mo, medyo matino yung ginawa niya, di ba? And then nung i-execute na, yung mga chipang na ginamit ng mga steel, chipang na paint, chipang na ano, yung mga hinari niya, mga problematic people, and then in the middle, he's cutting deals. So for me, I think it's like a good script potentially that went really wrong. So I think that's my reading, which I think is not something much discussed. So I'm very Hegelian, negation of negation. I don't buy any side of the argument. My argument is that there was something inherently good about it, but it just went wrong because Duterte just didn't have what it took. He didn't have the sophistication. And then second, ang sabog. And and let's be honest, he's the first guy to deal with China the way he did. So medyo uncharted territories din yan. So you get what I'm saying? It's a very nuanced take. It's totally different from the usual takes on Duterte. Ikaw, Miko, what do you think about that? Without jeopardizing your career. Tumatakas ka na. Yung first question ko pa lang, nag-off. Alam mo yung mga in-interview, tapos, hello, I cannot hear you. Kasi sagutin yung mga analyst sa Moscow. Like, what do you think about Putin's gonna, hello, I cannot hear you. Hello. Alam mo, muntik ka na kaya, Miko, ha?
Alam mo, Richard, meron akong banat dyan.
Sige, Josh,
minention mo na terrible architect siya. Ang tanong kasi, bakit kasi tawag natin chief architect of foreign policy?
A good architect, terrible engineer. Parang hindi siya magaling na civil engineer. Like yung execution ay sobrang pangit kasi chipang yung ginamit. Pero ang ganda nung architecture. Diversified relations, independent foreign policy, non-trade. I have nothing against it because it gives us more room for maneuver. In fact, if you hear Lee Kuan Yew and then you hear Duterte, I mean the more coherent version, they were not too different, except Lee Kuan Yew was both a good architect and a good engineer. Digong at best was a good architect, meaning big questions, but ang pangit sablay nung execution. I'm just saying, and many factors came in because Obama criticized him on human rights, Duterte, China helped him. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I don't see it in teleological terms. I just see it as a script that went sobrang off script, na sobrang wrong. And that's why I rather not look at it teleologically, although teleology helps me to psychologically appreciate it. That's where I see the value of what Justin was saying. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Miko, yeah.
Siguro with respect to Duterte, President Duterte himself, the jury is still out, I think. Before we could fully appreciate, for lack of a better term, what he did during his 6 years in office. I mean, the likes of President Truman, President Carter in the US, it took a number of decades before the public realized that the decisions that they made in office were right. So again, with respect to Duterte, I think the jury is still out. But if I may focus on the Duterte administration as a whole, siguro I'll jump off mula dun sa sinabi ni Josh. No? Yung kasi those of us who studied and teach Philippine foreign relations, Philippine foreign policy, we always, at some point in our lecture, nabanggit natin yan na the president is the chief architect of foreign policy. Now, going back to your question, Prof. Richard, of how Duterte, or in this case, the Duterte administration as a whole, will be viewed, allow me to wear my IR academic hat. Siguro what the Duterte administration showed us is, yes, in theory, the president is the chief architect of foreign policy, but in reality, what the Duterte administration showed us is the role of the different institutions within and outside government in shaping foreign policy. No, I think President Duterte came into office with a as you said, he may have been a good architect. He has his design, from the get-go, his speech in China, when he said he's aligning the Philippines with the ideological flow of China and Russia. Essentially, he did things that to many of us were inconceivable, like ending Balikatan, abrogating the VFA. And there were even talks of pulling out of EDCA at some point during his administration. But what prevented all of those from actually coming into fruition was the role of the different agencies. So dito,
Yun.
dito ngayon papasok yung bureaucratic politics approach ni Graham Allison in foreign policy. So I think the Duterte administration is a case study of that. Not just institutions, of course, the armed forces. I'll not go into details, but definitely the armed forces had a role in persuading the administration from keeping the pillars of the Philippines-US alliance intact. And of course, yung role din ng media, no? The media and the think tanks as well. Let's not underestimate din yung role ng think tanks when it comes to shaping the debate when it comes to our foreign relations. Yun nga, I think I forgot to mention this a while ago, but I think si Prof. Richard Data, yung the rise of epistemic communities, napaka-importante nun. Looking back now, Duterte has been out of office a little more than a year, June 2022 when he stepped down. So ngayon, nakikita natin yun ngayon. So I think while Duterte, the man, the former president, his thinking will be studied by historians for many years to come. At least now, as one who specializes in IR, like all of us here, I think yun yung one of the things na dun siya matatandaan, at least yung administration niya, yung the role of the different institutions when it comes to foreign relations. Kasi it was yung previous administrations naman, kumbaga, there's consistency in many ways yung pro-US. I mean, we've seen that from President Quezon onwards. There may be differences in approaches, in tactics, but the general approach was the same. It was yun nga, yung kay Duterte administration nga he attacked the very pillars of our alliance with the US. And as I said, what kept it intact was the different institutions, yung the military, the national security establishment, and let's not also underestimate yung role of the legislature. I remember that when Duterte had a spat with then Ambassador Philip Goldberg, because of the human rights issues and so on, he was not actually if I'm not mistaken,
bigyan siya ng award ng Philippine Congress.
It's the Congress, not the president. Kasi ideally it's the president who gives the award, but the Senate stepped in then to accord the then Ambassador Goldberg all of the courtesy and so on before he left. So yun nga, may role din yung Congress doon, and of course yung role of the national security establishment and the media and the think tank. So yun nga, Duterte administration, at least wearing my IR hat here, would at the very least be remembered. At saka na-highlight yung role ng different institutions, which is very good, kasi yung we are not a monolith. Hindi monolith yung ating foreign policy establishment. Na-highlight ng Duterte administration yon, yung role ng different institutions, keeping, for lack of a better term, yung checks and balances when it comes to foreign policy. Kasi we taught our students na yun nga, very legalistic yung approach. Chief architect of foreign policy, he has control, he's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. In theory, yes. But in practice, we saw how the interplay of the different organizations within and outside government in shaping Philippine foreign policy, which by the end, he abrogated his he abrogated his decision to end the VFA, binalik si Balikatan at towards the end of his administration. No? So nakita natin yung interplay of the different forces.
It was a
in shaping
contested foreign
policy.
policy, right, Miko? I mean,
Yeah.
I put it that way. I put it as a contested foreign policy, a clear case of the man, the moment, and the steady state, right? Like definitely all of those elements were there. Again, for those who covered Trump administration or even Modi in India or Bolsonaro, they have their version of this, even in Turkey, for instance, under Erdogan. So this is quite endemic in populist captured democracies, right? Ibang usapan na si Putin. I mean, good luck opposing the guy and staying alive and not falling off the third floor or 10th floor, right? I really appreciate that. This is really good. So I think we can end this episode on this. Mukhang madaldal tayong lahat, nahirapan tayo sa 20 minutes pala. But I think this sets a tone because what we're saying here is that the West Philippine Sea, as important as it is, it has triggered something bigger, which is the rediscovery of what it means to be a Filipino. It's kind of a birth of a nation on multiple levels, including birth of a steady state. We saw who are the real patriots. We saw who are not the real patriots or who are pretending to be patriots. Nabuking na eh. Nalaman natin eh. Who are the ones who are really trapos and who are medyo trapo pero actually may patriotism din at lumalaban. So I think very revealing yung 6 years of Duterte. But the most important thing, I think, especially Miko was emphasizing that, and I think Justin and Joshua can agree also, having worked in the government, is that you have to separate Duterte from the Duterte administration. The two are not necessarily the same. And I think one of the most fascinating aspects of the Duterte era, which you don't see in Trump or Erdogan or any populist I've studied, is this. He kept Lorenzana in position of power for quite some time. And he appointed very independent-minded people like Teddy Boy, muntik sabi ko, Tito Boy, Teddy Boy Locsin Jr., right? Who on many occasions were saying the complete opposite of Duterte. And not only got away with it, they kind of even were allowed to play their heroics games, no? So this, I think, makes Duterte very exceptional populist. Because in all other cases I studied, you go against the man, you're fired. Mattis had to go in the US. Erdogan fired so many central bankers and finance ministers who didn't go his way. Bolsonaro, I don't know how many people he fired throughout his short 4 years in office. That, I think, makes Duterte quite a unique case. No, that makes him interesting in historical comparative terms. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for that fascinating first episode. Let's just call it Rebirth of a Nation, the West Philippine Sea. Salamat. And next episode, let's discuss other important issues, including the Marcos Jr. administration, the bad, the good, the very, very good. Kasi nasa government yung iba, hindi ko magawa yung bad, good. The good, the bad, and ugly. Sige, ako na lang bahala doon sa iba. Thank you very much on that, gentlemen.